I'm Dan Snow. Welcome to Voices of the First World War. In the years leading up to the centenary of the war, the last of those who actually experienced it passed away. But the Imperial War Museums and the BBC had recorded interviews with many veterans to try to capture what it was like to actually be there. This series listens to those stories.
What did you and your brother officers think of the German enemy? Did you hate them or not?
Hate them? I never hated anybody. You couldn't hate the fact that 500 yards away was a German doing exactly the same thing as you should be doing. Can't hate a man for that.
Did you respect them?
Yes. In every way.
The recordings of First World War veterans in the Imperial War Museum and the BBC Sound Archives were made more than 50 years after the events that they were being asked to recall. But their memories are often clear. Naturally, experiences differed widely, dependent on different postings, commanders, comrades, weather, luck. By 1915, some soldiers had been fighting for 5 months and were getting used to war. They were becoming hardened.
You see, things happened. People were killed almost alongside you. By that time, you got into the sort of fatalistic attitude, well, hard luck, chum. It might be my turn next, so what?
Did that develop quite quickly, that attitude?
Oh, I think so.
1915 was the year that the Germans expanded their efforts in the east, which made some sectors of the Western Front very quiet.
On a nice summer's day, you'd settle down to a day of laziness in the sun if you could. During those summer months of 1915, you could forget that there was a war on. You really could.
Private E.L. Todd was an officer's servant, interviewed by the BBC in 1963.
The lads would sit along the fire step and talk and sing. Coming towards the evening, they'd get sentimental, talking about their homes. We had one chap who was a very, very good singer, and he used to lead us in the choruses. And he was always inclined to get a bit sentimental, but we had to shut him up for obvious reasons. I mean, we couldn't stand too much of that. And then there was old Cornet Joe over in the German front line who used to blow his cornet and play to us the British songs. He'd play a song and we'd shout over to him, "Damn good, Jerry, give us another one, Joe." And he'd ask us what we wanted, because the lines weren't too far away. And sometimes that session would last for half an hour. We had our mouth organs, of course, and, well, there was nothing else to do but talk, reminisce, and sing.
I want to make clear that although we used to grouse and grumble, there was never any real resentment. There was total acceptance of everything that happened. I mean, it was simply a case of driving sheep to the slaughter. That's all it was, really. I mean, you take 1915, the Battle of Neuve Chapelle.
There were significant battles in 1915 on the Western Front, now largely forgotten. One was in Neuve Chapelle, close to Ypres, on the French side of the Belgian border.
This was one bit of rising ground in what was otherwise complete flat bog, and so whoever had that ground could look into the other people's defences with impunity.
This started on the 10th of March 1915 at dawn.
And it was a lovely morning. The skylights were soaring up to heaven. It was fairly silent. 8 o'clock, a large gun boomed back behind the lines, and within seconds, hell was let loose. Every gun, I think on a mile front, was blasting at full force, just on the dot of 8.
Now, before the attack at Neuve Chapelle by the British Army began, I believe there was a remarkably intense artillery bombardment.
Yes, the bombardment was the most impressive that I think I heard throughout the war. It was quite brief, and it was nearly all field gun fire, but the guns were fired at such a rapid rate that the noise was absolutely shattering.
And this kept up for some time with the large shells, you could hear the large shells roaring right over the top of you. And we weren't displeased with it at all because it was all going the other way.
And where it was accurate against the German breastworks, it had a most decisive effect, and our advancing infantry suffered only moderate losses.
Captain Philip Neame, who just received the Victoria Cross, he'd overseen the construction of assembly trenches prior to the Battle of Neuve Chapelle. The British were trying to blast through the German barbed wire before the infantry went over the top. They were trying to take the German front line and regain the village of Neuve Chapelle. It worked, in part.
But after a bit, we found one or two coming our way, which wasn't quite so pleasant.
The interviews with veterans tell us not just what happened, but how the soldiers remembered it. Trooper Walter Becklade interviewed for the BBC Great War series in 1963.
And eventually we had to go over the top, and we went on so far, but we didn't meet the enemy because they'd gone on too far, and we were called away on our left to occupy another trench. And this was about dinner time. They were beginning to get hungry.
You'd think they'd remember going over the top every minute of crossing no man's land, the sensations, the fears, the drama of it all, but often they don't.
Historian Peter Hart carried out many of the interviews in the Imperial War Museum's archive.
And it's like they're in a daze, a blur. Then suddenly they'll fixate on some small details, almost inconsequential in contrast, but they often remember when they're wounded. That is something that, for obvious reasons, stays with them.
And I thought we'd have some bully beef. That's all we had. We had a tin of bully beef. I got the tin opener in my hand, all ready to open this tin of beef. There was a shell burst, and I felt a terrific bang on my right arm, which caused me to drop the tin opener in the mud. I never found it again. And I didn't realize at the time actually that I was wounded until the blood started coming down, running off the end of my hand.
It's what they remember, and the rest has sort of blurred away or been suppressed by their mind, or I don't know what's happened to it.
And he took me in this funk hole, and from some marvellous cookhouse, he bought me a Dixie of hot tea, which was just what I needed. It went down beautifully, although I think it tasted of petrol a little bit. The water must have been brought up in petrol cans.
The attack was strange. It was a success. But where the artillery failed, it was a disaster for 2 or 3 battalions. And often those are the accounts that are left, and yet they are not typical of what happened. If you were in one of the units that ran into trouble when the attack breaks down, it was awful. And it's very difficult to square the circle of what seems in a cold history to be, a successful attack. And for you, it was an absolute flaming disaster.
On your particular sector of the front, did the artillery bombardment do its job?
On the left part of the brigade on which I was working, the artillery bombardment failed. The result was the German trenches were not damaged, and the left battalion was decimated when they got up and clambered over our breastwork. To my horror, I saw them practically mown down.
There are problems in the archive with Neuve Chapelle because it was very early on in the war, and people had to live for another 3 years of fighting, and then they had to live another 70-odd years, And then a lot of the forces involved were Indian, and the only source we have there is officers. But they were pre-war regulars, most of them. They had to learn the various Indian languages. And in 1986, 7, 8, they were extremely old. There weren't many of them left. So there is a gap with Neuve Chapelle. There are not as many interviews as we might have hoped.
So I went up, if you can imagine, the place was quite devastated, firing going on all round. Some rifle fire, a great deal of machine gun fire.
Second Lieutenant John Wedderburn Maxwell was with the guns of the Royal Field Artillery. He took up position with the infantry to take the place of the lieutenant who'd just been killed.
Well, I was sitting just like we are here, and all of a sudden my little signal boy, very young, about my age, 2019, he suddenly was flat dead. We watched these heavy shells coming over from the Germans, who had woken up then to the fact that it was very serious business.
This is about as close as we can get to the battle in the archive.
And you heard these things coming. He got on landing, and there you could see them. Oh, quite a long way away, a couple of hundred yards away, and it was the same target the whole time across roads with nobody on it or anything, but you saw a black thing hurtled to the ground and then a huge spray of black smoke at the height of those trees there.
There was confusion on the ground. It was almost impossible for the infantry to communicate with the artillery. The British guns were also running out of ammunition.
And the casualties were enormous. This is the first really big battle of that type. We did not know what a deadly weapon the machine gun was. And we did not realise that the wire wasn't cut and took a lot more to cut than what we could provide.
For an advance of just 1 mile, over 10,000 men were killed or wounded. Well over a third of them were Indian.
Had you ever seen anything quite as disastrous as the effect of the German, particularly machine gun fire, on those infantry forces?
No, I never, throughout the war, I never saw such dreadful casualties as occurred on that particular bit of front.
It only led to an intensification of war. Surprised by the power of the artillery bombardment on the first day of the battle, the Germans improved their defences, adding new lines of trenches. The heavy expenditure of ammunition by the British on the first day used up almost a third of the field gun ammunition stocks of the First Army. Shell production couldn't possibly match this kind of demand going forward, and news of the ammunition shortage led to the shell crisis of 1915, one of the factors in bringing down the Asquith government the following year. The human impact of the battle was devastating, and there was no let-up for the survivors.
And then the wounded were being carried out to the first field dressing station. They were walking wounded, and those being carried on stretchers. Well, I was with the walking wounded and stopped to rest at what I thought appeared to be a railway sleeper. I thought they were going to put them in the bottom of the trench to make it a little cleaner, but on closer inspection, it turned out to be piles of bodies, all stacked up like railway sleepers, waiting to be taken back.
When we were told to go and do something, one went and did it. That's being a soldier, really, isn't it? One did one's best to produce fire when it was required. This was our sole job, of looking after the infantry as far as we could. What was left of the poor chaps.
And I can remember going up to the line after the Battle of Neuve Chapelle was over, and all I could hear was the screams of wounded men out in no man's land. They hadn't got even to the German barbed wire, or no further than the German barbed wire, and they were all cut down by it.
Was that very upsetting for you, to witness that sort of thing?
You'd be surprised how human beings can get... I'm very sceptical about human nature. They can get used to anything. You'd be surprised.